Hey there, it's Simon Hurley from Inklips and welcome to another video. Now I'm super excited for today's video. It's one of my favorites. I'm going to be showing how to do acrylic black stamping to get some really cool and unique watercolor backgrounds that look really awesome on your cards. And I'm also going to share what I like to call coloring for people who really don't love to color. So if you love those images with the lines and kind of more cutesy images, but you don't love to color them in, I'm going to show the bare necessity kind of like shading with not really coloring the whole image in, because I know that can be quite daunting sometimes, but it really creates an awesome look on your card still. So without further ado, let's get right on into the video tutorial. So let's start off here by showing how to create all these different backgrounds, and then at the end of the video, I'll show how to put all the cards together and finish them off nicely. So I'm going to start off with a small round acrylic block here, and I'm going to apply 3 different colors to it. Now for all my cards, I'm using Distress Oxides for today's video just because I love the way that they oxidize once you're done, but you could really play around with the different dye inks you have and really create some cool cards with whatever inks you guys have on hand as well. I just love the look of these personally. So I'm going to use the corner of the ink pad to just apply stripes of color onto here. You want to avoid mixing the inks together, but if it happens, it's totally fine. You just want to wipe off your ink pad to get rid of any of that excess ink that's on top. So I sprayed that quite a bit so there's big bubbles on top there. You want lots of water on there because this is what's going to help move around the color and give it kind of a tie-dyed, almost like mixed around marbled look. So I flipped that over to the cardstock there, and then I'm going to give it nice pressure. And I've skipped ahead here, but I left it on there for just a little while. And here's when I was still kind of learning how to pull them off. So you don't want to pull it off and then put it right back down. You want to just lift it right off, and it might move the color a little bit, but you get a really awesome look like that. And by leaving it on the cardstock for a little bit longer, the color moves around less when you pick it up since it's already started to dry. So now I'm going to show you guys how to create kind of a fun background for some really awesome scenes. So for this one, I'm just applying ink to one side of a small square acrylic block, and then I'll add another color on the opposite side. And you can see I left quite a bit of room in the center, but with lots of water that's going to fill in when we press it onto our surface. So I've sprayed on lots of water there, and then I'm going to apply my acrylic block down to my surface and kind of let it sink in there. And I also wanted to mention that for all these cards today, I am using Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I like that because it's a nice bright white cardstock for my cards, but also because the watercolor cardstock is going to give you the best look when using this amount of water and creating these watercolor techniques. So now I'm going in with some more colors here. I'm using a blue and green for this one, and another thing that I like to do is kind of mix cool colors on one block and warm colors on the other. That way you can kind of avoid getting mud, and you know they're going to mix together really nicely. So these are the cooler colors, and I'm going to overlap that onto the other square just a little bit. We're going to kind of create a scene with this one a little bit later, and you'll see how it turns out, but it's really cool to use several smaller blocks to create a background like this one. So I've left that on for a little while, and then I'm going to pull it right off my card. And then I'm using a tiny little block, and I'm going to apply some kind of tan color on there, and then I'll spray that down, and I'll stamp that right down onto the surface as well. Now at this point, I've kind of learned that it's best to leave it on there for a little while, and then hold it down with one hand on the cardstock, and then lift with one hand of the acrylic block straight up, and it'll give you the best look with less movement of the ink. So now for this one, I'm using a shaped acrylic block, and also I'll link down below to some of the acrylic blocks that I used today. These ones have little kind of ridges at the edges of them, and it creates a really cool look for your background and adds just a little bit of extra interest, which I think is really cool. So I'm adding some blues and greens to this acrylic block here, and I'm just adding them in lines, and you can see I'm not adding down tons of ink. I'm just adding down a couple different colors, and on this one I got a little bit of excess color there on that ink pad, but I'm just adding a couple colors, and that water is going to really help move around all that ink and fill in all those areas. So then I'm going to flip that over onto the watercolor cardstock and stamp it down onto the surface there. And you can kind of apply different amounts of pressure. You can see some of that ink moving in there and kind of marbling a little bit as I apply some pressure on the block there. And then I'm going to press on that with another acrylic block, and here's something you could do. You can set it right off to the side for it to kind of dry, and then you'll get no movement of the ink at all. So if you want that background just how it is, leave it off to the side to dry a little bit and then lift it off a little later. Now for this one, I thought this was super cool. There's this acrylic block that has a longer and kind of thinner body, and that way you can add sentiments onto it. But for this, I'm going to apply a lighter color of ink on the inside, add some darker color that goes right along with it so it looks a little bit like shading, and then, spritz it with water and put it down onto the cardstock. Now for this, I'm going to line 4 of these down, going onto the cardstock here, and this is just another cool background to create a scene. So instead of it being a solid background, you have nice little stripes, and each stripe is going to have a different color in it. Now all these cards that I'm creating are Christmas cards, and you could totally go with the regular Christmas colors, but I like to kind of play around with different color schemes and things like that. So a lot of them are blues and greens, and this one was kind of red, orange, and greens to kind of go along with that Christmas theme, but it's a little bit more modern, and I've kind of moved around the color scheme just a little bit, which I think is always fun to do with Christmas cards. So I'm going to apply lots of water to this one and then put it down at the end there. And also when you're applying lighter colors, you want to apply the darker color second, because then, the lighter color won't really transfer onto the darker ink pad as much. So you can kind of roll the ink pad onto the edge and get some really cool shading like that. Now for this one, I'm going to create a classic sky look, so I've taken a rectangle block that's a little bit longer and kind of, thinner as well, and I'm going to apply some inks onto it. Now I tend to use this, it's kind of like a tan color, and then I have an orange and a pink, and then I'll go into a purple and blue kind of color there. And that creates a really nice sky background, and I wanted to do that today since I have some stamps that'll go along with that perfectly. So I'm applying some of that ink down into those stripes there, and then I'm going to spray it down with some water here. Now I could have definitely added more water to this one. I went a little bit light-handed on this one, and the ink didn't move around nearly as much, but that can be a look that you're going for too. So you can kind of play around with the amount of water that you add to it and see which effect you like better. So for this one, I'll press it down onto the surface, and the colors kind of stay where they are. They don't really move around a ton. They kind of keep a nice crisp line, which might be what you want once you're done. So you can see it moved out a little bit there, and then I'm going to slowly and carefully lift this off, and you get that really cool background there that looks like a nice nighttime sky or sunset, which is really awesome for cards and creating different scenes. Now for this one, I used one of those ridge blocks as well, and I'm going to create another different nighttime sky here. So I'm using some blues, teals, pinks, and purples. And now these last 2 backgrounds that I'm creating here, I didn't use, but I wanted to share these examples because I thought they were pretty fun. So I'll spray this one down with lots of water here, and then I'm going to bring it down to the surface of the card. And when I'm doing this, I kind of am laying them out into different spots on the card where I might want them to be if I actually kept the layout like this. Some of them I ended up cutting out, but some of them I kept exactly how they were. So you can kind of play around with different placement that you might like for the cards. So then I'm going to lift that one up, and you can see that one moved a little bit, but it created a cool texture in that background there. And I'll just wipe off the acrylic block. It's really easy cleanup since these are nice water-based inks. Then for this last one, I'm going to apply some color to the acrylic block. However, I've been doing all of these past ones in like stripes of color, so I wanted to do this one in little blotches of color here and there. So I just used the corner of the ink pad and tapped in some color in different areas on the block. So it's not going in lines, it's just random, and I think that creates a really cool background there you can use on your cards and have a really nice variegated color on your background rather than having just stripes of parallel colors. So then after I'm done applying the color there, I'm going to apply lots of water onto here so I can get those colors to move a little bit. So I'm going to spray this one down, and then I'm going to bring it over to my watercolor cardstock, and we can tip it over and press it down onto the surface there. You can really get those colors to move by adding some of that pressure. You can see them moving together and creating that tie-dye kind of mixed color effect, which I really like. So I'll lift that one off, and that finishes off all the backgrounds. So now let's move into actually finishing off the cards. So for this first one here, this is the circle block that we used. I created a fun little scene with just 2 of the animals walking. So these are all Hello Bluebird stamp sets that I'm using today. I'll have them linked down below. They are so adorable with some awesome images here for these Christmas stamp sets. Now I like to take the clear plastic sheet with all the stamps on it and kind of line up my scene before I even bring out any stamps. And then I took this little fox here, and I'm going to stamp it down onto the surface, almost like I'm using this circle piece as like a sun or like a nighttime sky, and they're kind of like walking down into the town. So I'm stamped down that fox onto some really thin paper that I'm going to use as masking paper here. So I'm just cutting it out, and I'm going to cut out the little lamp and kind of arm side of the fox. I don't need to cut out the whole thing for a mask, but I'm just cutting out this section because I want to stamp down a little critter right in front of him, and I want there to be kind of overlapping so it looks like you created a really fun scene there. So I really quickly did that mask. It wasn't perfect by any means, but I'm going to place that down with some repositionable adhesive, and then I'll take my squirrel and I'm going to stamp that down right in front of the fox. And so I needed to do this because the squirrel's tail is going to kind of, run in the way of the fox, so I'm stamping that over top of that lamp area. And then when I peel off that mask, it's going to have those images really nicely aligned and the fox will be in front. So whatever you want in front, you want to stamp first. Now moving on to the coloring technique that I was talking about. This is kind of what I call coloring for people who really don't want to color. Sometimes I don't feel like coloring in these full images or scenes, and I just want to create a really quick look. So since I have this colored background already, all I need to do is just take some gray markers and add a little bit of shading. And this is going to make those images really pop off and stand out on the cards and give you that really nice shadowed and dimensional look. And I'll go in more detail on some other cards that I created with that coloring technique later in the video, but I just went over that quick for this one since this card is a little bit longer. So now I took one of the sentiments from the set and I'm going to stamp it down with some clear sticky ink, and then I'm going to bring in some white heat embossing powder, sprinkle it right over top, and then I'll heat emboss that for a nice crisp and white sentiment, which I always really love. So here is how that finished card looked with that coloring and the stamping over top of that really fun colored background. Now to finish this card off, all I did was take it in my little Fiskars paper trimmer here. You need one that kind of slides like this, and I'm going to just slide it right up until that little fox's foot, and then I'll bring it up to the top and slide it right up until that circle, leaving a little bit of white space in between there. And this leaves me that opportunity to go in with a scissors and fussy cut right around those images. I'm leaving a little bit of a white border so it can stand out against the colored cardstock that I use, but then when I cut this out, it really creates a nice dynamic look since I can put some colored cardstock behind it and not have as much white showing, but have that little fox kind of sticking out of that circle and get a really awesome look like that. So moving the cardstock also really helps. So instead of moving the scissors along, if you're having trouble fussy cutting, try moving the cardstock and you get a really nice, smooth, and clean look when you're done cutting. So then once I'm finished with that, I've added lots of foam tape onto that watercolor piece that we did, and I'm going to add that onto a folded, top folding Gina K Turquoise C cardstock. And then I'm going to apply it right down onto there, and that adds some nice dimension, but also kept the card really nice and simple with just that nice colored cardstock background. I really love how this one turned out on there, but again, I kept it really simple since I wanted the focus to be on the images and that nice colored background that we created. So now for this next card, I'm sharing how to use those squares to create a really fun scene like I was talking about. So I'm using this fun little pig set from Hello Bluebird. I love this set with those fun little pigs there. And again, I'm using that clear packaging to decide exactly where I want to put the pigs before I stamp them down. So this just takes out a little bit of guesswork, seeing if the different images will fit in different areas, and then I can pull them out and actually stamp them down. So in that top square, I'm going to stamp the little piggy holding the present. I thought that fit perfectly up there. And then I'm going to go in with the little pig staring upward, and I'm going to stamp that in the bottom square. Now that's going to be actually staring up at the sentiment. So this is super fun. I stamped down a little Merry Christmas sentiment, and the little pig is staring directly up at it, which I think is so adorable. So like I said, having these little square blocks is really great to create scenes like this. Now there was also a little pig carrying a Christmas tree on a cart, but that wasn't going to fit on my card, so I masked off the cart and the little pig with some tape here, and then I'm going to just stamp down that little tree right next to the little pig that's kind of staring up at the sentiment, and I thought that completed the scene perfectly and added a little bit more of a Christmas element to it, as well as some snowflakes that I stamped there too. So here's where I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about this coloring. So I don't love to color these images in always. Sometimes I like to skimp out on the coloring a little bit since it takes such a long time. Since we've already got these beautiful colored backgrounds, I figured I could stamp them right onto them, and all I had to do was add a little bit of shading. So I'm using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens, but Copic markers would also work for this technique, and I'm just going to go in with a light gray color here. And then I'm going to just kind of shade around some of the areas that I find it necessary. So kind of wherever any body part meets, I add a little bit of shading, or if the little pig, like here, he's holding a present, I'll add a little bit of shading there too to make the present stand out on the card. I kind of just throw shading wherever I see it necessary. I don't go with any certain light sources, and it all seems to work out in the end perfectly. So after I'm done adding that lighter gray color in there, I go in with the darker gray color. So I chose one that's a little bit darker, and this I just add little touches of here and there. This is a pretty strong color, so adding the little darker shading really makes some of the parts of the images really pop out. So like I said, I'll do it underneath the present and kind of around some different areas, but I won't add nearly as much as I did of the light gray color, since this one really stands out and adds tons of contrast. Then I'm going to go in with a water brush, and I'll just finish this off by softening up the edges of some of those lines. Now I wasn't going to completely pull out the color. Since we're working not on Bristol, it's not going to pull it all out, but it's just going to soften the edges a little bit, which I find pretty important, and I love how this pig scene turned out. With those little squares, I thought it was just absolutely perfect and added lots of interest. So I just cut those out and added a little bit of a white border on the outside, kept it pretty simple, and just added it onto a top folding craft card base. It was already pretty busy, so I wanted to keep the background pretty darn simple. So that finishes off that card, and I absolutely love how that one turned out. Again, it's not really traditional Christmas card, but I really love using non-traditional colors. So for this next one, I'm going to kind of share something a little bit different. For this one, I'm using another image from Hello Bluebird. It's just absolutely adorable, this bear carrying the tree. But for this one, I'm doing a little bit of embossing. So I'm going to take some anti-sag powder bag and add it down onto the background there. You want to make sure it's completely dry. And then I'll take some clear sticky ink and stamp the image right down over top of the colored background. And now I'm going to take my white embossing powder, and I can easily sprinkle this over top of my background. I keep it in a nice big container like this since I use it all the time, and for backgrounds like this, it makes it a lot easier to apply with less cleanup as well, which is really nice. So I keep white and clear in these larger containers. Now I'm going to bring in my heat tool here and heat emboss that, and that's going to create a nice little resist, so when we're coloring here, you're easily able to add the color and you don't have to worry about going over the lines, but also that nice white crisp line really gives some contrast against that colored background. So you can go with the white or the black. I think they both look really stunning and create different effects for sure. So now here I'm adding some gray color again, starting off with that lighter gray color, and then adding a little bit of shading with that darker gray color, and watering it out to kind of smooth out that coloring. If you wanted to, you definitely could cut these images out onto some white cardstock and color them in completely and then add them on top of these backgrounds, but I really wanted to kind of incorporate them into the backgrounds rather than having it be a completely separate image. I wanted you to be able to see some of that background color shining through all the images, and this is the perfect way to do that while still adding a little bit of depth and dimension to all these images, which I think is definitely really important. So I'm stamping down the Christmas greetings sentiment. I just love that little font there, and I stamped it on a diagonal to follow along with the tree. So that finishes off that background perfectly. I think those colors go really nicely with that tree. And then I'm going to cut this out with a little bit of a white border around the outside as well. Now I like to use these big Tim Holtz shears for this, but you could definitely go in with some smaller scissors to kind of fussy cut around the edges. And once that's done, I'll add some foam tape onto the back there, and I'm going to just add this down to another craft card base, again keeping it super simple. I just added it down right onto the background there, onto an A2 size card base. And then to finish it off, since the corners are rounded of the acrylic block, I decided it would be perfect to go in with my corner chomper. I haven't used this in such a long time, and I'm going to do a little 1/2 inch corner chomp on each side. And this just kind of, like I said, carries around those round edges throughout the whole card, which I think is awesome. Now for this next card, I'm going to share kind of how to create a comic strip-like background with those different lines that we created. So I love how this background turned out. It's just beautiful. And I'm going to use 2 different images from 2 sets from Hello Bluebird. These are so adorable. They're like little animals carrying different things on their little carts here, kind of going through the snow. And they're all winter themed, which I think is really fun. For Christmas cards, again, keeping that non-traditional color scheme, which I really do love. So I'm going to stamp these down with some Archival ink, which is going to be waterproof. So when we do our coloring here, it's not going to bleed or anything. And I'm stamping those, and they happen to go in different directions, which I think is so much fun. So stamping them both onto those different lines that we created of color. And then I'll stamp the Christmas greetings sentiment right in the center. It seems to fit perfectly there. Now for this background, I wanted to start off by taking some of that Distress Oxides from the stripes that we created and just filling in those areas in the center in between both of those lines so that it adds a little bit of color inside the pig and makes it look like it belongs in that section a little bit more, so kind of blending some of that color out. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing I've been doing this whole time. So taking my gray Zig Clean Color Real Brush pen, and I'm going to add a little bit of shading with the lighter one, and then I'm going to water that out and add a little bit of shading with the darker one as well. Now I said you could do this with copic markers as well. That would be a really fun idea to just add a little bit of shading with the copic markers, but you could also do it with colored pencils or things like that. So you really want to think outside the box. If you don't have these watercolor markers or you're not too fond of using them, you might want to use a different coloring medium. Just adding a little bit of gray of whatever you have just adds a little bit of depth and dimension onto your card and really makes these images stand out and pop. It's a huge difference from how it started with just a plain black lined image. So then going in, softening out some of those edges, and that really does soften them out and gives them a really nice look with all that fun shading there. So here's that finished background. I absolutely love how that stamping and coloring looks, and I think that completes off that fun lined background absolutely perfectly. So now I'm going to trim that down a little bit, and I've added some foam tape, actually lots of foam tape onto the back of this. And I'm just going to, again, keep it super simple, focus on the colored background that we created, and just add it onto a white card base there. And I love how this one turned out. I think it might be my favorite, just because it's so unique with those different lines. Now for this last one here, I said we created a nighttime sky, so I wanted to reflect that and create a fun little scene of images. So this stamp set is so fun. It has their little backs turned of all different animals, and they're all looking up at the stars. And so it comes with all these fun animals and also the different stars. It's kind of like a New Year's set. So I'm going to take all these images in my Misty stamping tool, and I'm going to stamp them down again with Archival ink. Now the reason I'm doing all these in the Misty tool is to make sure that I had all the lining up perfectly before I stamped them all down, and also if I needed to I can stamp them twice. So since we're stamping on the watercolor cardstock, even though it's the smooth side, sometimes it could use a little bit of assistance with stamping. So then I stamped down the sentiment right below it. I absolutely love that sentiment. And then I'm going to add in my little shading and coloring as well. Now for this one, you might ask if you even want to add the shading to that white section there, since it's not that colored part. I happened to add the shading to all of it, but you could definitely just keep the shading on the colored part and kind of add the white part with less shading and make it not stand out, kind of give a little bit of contrast there and a fun look to your card. But I just added shading whether it was on the colored section or not. I think it looks really awesome like that, and it makes all the images stand out really nicely on the card. So I'm just going in with some of that darker color and finishing off. Again, I really just barely even touched the tip of that marker onto some of the sections, and it really adds lots of color and really packs a punch. It's super powerful. So you want to be a little bit careful with how much color of that darker marker you do add. So once I'm done with all of this, I want to make sure the background is bone dry after all that coloring, since I did add a little bit of watercolor, and I'm going to do some embossing. So I heat set that again, and then I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool to make sure that everything is not going to stick to the embossing powder. So I'm taking the stars from the set, and I'm going to use some clear mark ink to stamp these down onto the background there. And I'm just going to, I've already lined them up over top of all the images to go right around them. And then I'm going to use some white and heat embossing powder and sprinkle it right over top of all those different stars. So this is going to give us a really nice contrast against the background that we created, against that really nice, fun, bright background, and finishes off the scene with those fun little stars from the set. I absolutely love how those look, and it gives it a really awesome look to this card and completes it perfectly. So I just heat set that until it was all nice and bright white, and then that finishes off my card, just adding it to a gray card base. And for all these I added glossy accents and different shimmering things to kind of finish off the card completely, but for the most part, I kept the cards and the backgrounds really simple because I wanted to focus on the fun colored backgrounds we created. Alright, so I hope you guys found this video tutorial very inspiring. If you did, please share it with a friend and give it a big thumbs up as well. And also, if you want to, click that subscribe button down below. That way you'll never miss another crafting video like this one from me. Now also, if you want to chat with me down below, I would love to talk to you guys in the comment section below. Let me know which card was your favorite, and I cannot wait to chat with you all down there. I'll see you guys very soon in another card making and crafting video. Have a great day. Bye!